They told her it was a scenic drive. Instead, her own daughter abandoned the elderly mother on a desolate dirt road. Just when she thought all was lost, a faint cry led her to an abandoned barn. What she found inside a dying man, 2 newborn babies, and a suitcase full of cash wouldn't just test her courage. It would expose a shocking secret directly connected to the very people who discarded her. This story is proof that the cruelest betrayal can lead to the greatest blessing. We are so grateful you're here. Please hit the like button right now so this story can spread to more people, and let's get started. The SUV moved slowly down the dusty roads of South Jersey as the sun set over the endless vineyards, painting the landscape in a warm, deceptively peaceful gold. From the back seat, Mrs. Margaret Hayes watched the horizon with a mix of nostalgia and nervousness. Her wrinkled hands tightly gripped a small canvas tote bag, the only luggage her daughter had insisted she bring. Through the rearview mirror, Mark, her son-in-law, shot glances that looked like knives disguised as smiles, those tense smiles that never managed to reach his eyes. Jessica, her daughter, remained silent, her eyes fixed on the road, gripping the steering wheel as if her life depended on it. Margaret tried to break the ice, saying how beautiful the scenery was, reminding her of the summers when she and her late husband used to drive along the outer coastal plain wine trail. But Jessica's reply was barely an absent whisper. "Yeah, Mom, it's nice." Like someone answering out of obligation. There was a strange density in the air, as if every mile covered moved them further not just from the city, but from something much deeper, a bond, a history, a family. The SUV turned sharply to the right, heading down a dirt road where the trees seemed drier and the road signs had disappeared. Margaret felt a slight tremor in her hands and asked where exactly they were going, because she didn't remember this being the route to any winery. Mark answered in an almost mechanical tone that it was a shortcut, that they would avoid the tourist traffic. Jessica nodded without looking at her, as if her husband's words were also her own. Margaret tried to calm the anxiety rising in her throat, telling herself that maybe she was exaggerating, that her daughter and son-in-law just wanted to show her a different corner of New Jersey. Suddenly, the vehicle stopped short. Dust rose around it like a thick cloud, covering the sun, making it look like a dim disk in the sky. Mark turned off the engine and got out of the SUV without a word. He walked a few steps, surveying the area with a look Margaret couldn't decipher. She asked him if there was a problem, if the SUV had broken down. But he said no, they just needed to make a quick technical stop so he and Jessica could talk for a moment. Jessica turned in her seat and, for the first time in hours, looked her mother in the eyes. Her pupils trembled as if a storm was raging behind them. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking but strangely firm. "You can be peaceful here, away from the noise." Margaret felt those words, so simple on the surface, carry an impossible weight. Peaceful, away from the noise, she repeated in her mind, trying to make logical sense of it. But the only feeling growing in her chest was a cold anguish. Mark opened the back door and extended his hand, not in a gentlemanly gesture, but an impatient, almost authoritarian one. "Come on, Margaret," he said with a false smile that cracked at the corners of his lips. "This is a good place to stretch your legs and get some fresh air." Margaret hesitated. Her legs didn't respond immediately, and her heart was beating with a painful force. When she finally got out, she realized the road was completely deserted. No houses, no signs of life, just the sound of the wind and the crunch of dry branches. Mark took her small bag and left it on the dirt by her feet. Jessica got out of the SUV, approached slowly, and gave her a kiss on the cheek, a kiss as cold as marble, while saying, "Mom, trust us. This is for the best." Margaret wanted to ask what that meant. She wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but the words got stuck in her throat, choked by disbelief. Before she could react, Mark got back in the SUV. Jessica gave her one last look that mixed guilt and decision, and without another word, they both got into the vehicle. Margaret held out a trembling hand, saying, "Don't leave me here, please. What are you doing?" But the sound of the engine starting up drowned out her pleas. The vehicle turned around, kicking up another cloud of dust that soon enveloped her, blinding her momentarily. When the dust settled, Margaret was alone, standing in the middle of an unknown dirt road with a small bag and a shattered heart. The sound of the tires driving away was the last thing she heard before the absolute silence wrapped around her like a cold blanket. "I don't understand why my own daughter would abandon me like an old piece of furniture," she thought, a knot in her throat as tears began to trace paths down her aged cheeks. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly on Margaret's weathered skin, while every step on the parched earth felt like a struggle against time itself, an invisible enemy dragging her toward an uncertain fate. Her feet, encased in old shoes that hadn't been made for long walks in years, were beginning to bleed inside her socks, a damp, sticky sensation that mixed with the sting of burst blisters. Her breathing was shallow, a constant gasp that echoed in the loneliness of that endless road where not even the birds seemed to dare to sing. Every so often, Margaret stopped, resting the small bag on her trembling knees and murmuring words she could barely hear, broken phrases that were half plea, half reproach, as if trying to convince herself that none of this was real, that at any moment an SUV would appear behind her with Jessica rushing out, saying it had been a mistake, a misunderstanding, that they couldn't leave her alone in this desolate place. But with every minute that passed, the certainty that no one was coming back for her became sharper, like a thorn sinking deeper and deeper into her flesh. The heat enveloped her in a cruel embrace as her wrinkled hands began to shake, not just from the physical effort, but also from the growing fear that constricted her chest. Margaret looked up at the horizon, searching for any sign of life, and it was then that in the distance, through the heat haze that distorted the silhouettes, she thought she could make out a building. She squinted, her heavy eyelids struggling to focus, and saw what looked like an old farmhouse with dilapidated shingles and walls that were once white, now covered in mildew stains and years of neglect. Her heart leaped not with complete hope, but with that timid hope one allows when there are no other options, when the body is on the verge of giving up and only the mind keeps pushing. Maybe there would be a phone, maybe someone, a caretaker, a farm worker who could give her a glass of water and let her rest for a moment. Maybe, she repeated like a mantra, forcing her bloodied feet to keep moving. The farm was surrounded by a wire fence, broken in several places, and a rusty iron gate that barely hung from its hinges. Margaret pushed it with all her strength, hearing a sharp screech that sent a shiver down her spine, as if the sound was a warning cry only she could hear. She crossed the threshold with hesitant steps, feeling the cool air inside contrast with the suffocating air outside. The floor was covered in dust and dry leaves. Every crunch under her feet seemed to multiply in the absolute silence, making her feel that she wasn't alone, that maybe someone was watching her from the shadows. Margaret swallowed hard and called out softly, asking if anyone was there, but her voice was lost in the hollow echo of the empty house. She advanced cautiously, her eyes trying to adjust to the gloom as sunlight filtered in thin shafts through broken windows and cracks in the roof. In one of the side rooms, she saw a dusty wooden bench, and in that moment, exhaustion hit her with full force. Her legs gave way, and she let herself fall heavily, feeling the weight of her years and emotional pain crush her against the wood. She sobbed with her face in her hands, hot tears carving paths through the wrinkles of a face that had known so much joy and so much loss, and which now felt more alone than ever. Between sobs, she whispered, "God, why are they doing this to me? What did I do to deserve my own daughter treating me like I'm a burden, like something that can just be discarded in the middle of nowhere?" She painfully remembered every moment she held Jessica as a child, when she taught her to walk, when she cared for her during feverish nights, when she worked tirelessly so she would want for nothing. And now the image of that same daughter, telling her in a trembling but determined voice, "You can be peaceful here, away from the noise," repeated in her mind like a cruel echo. The silence of the house was so deep she could hear her own heartbeat, an irregular drumming that seemed to want to escape her chest. Suddenly, something changed in the air. A subtle sound mixed with the whisper of the wind, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, but enough to make Margaret hold her breath. She raised her head, her red eyes searching the gloom, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her, or if she had really heard crying. The sound returned, clearer this time, a soft, choked cry, coming from the back of the farm, perhaps from the barn she had glimpsed upon entering. Fear mixed with a strange determination in her chest as she forced herself to stand up, her knees protesting with a painful creak. With slow, careful steps, she began to walk toward the source of the cry, every fiber of her being tense, not knowing what she would find behind those time-worn doors. Margaret moved forward, her body tense, and her heart pounding so hard she could feel it thrumming in her ears, like a war drum. Every step she took on the wooden floor creaked under her weight, and the echo seemed to announce her presence in the gloom. She fumbled in her small tote bag, her fingers brushing against her phone. She pulled it out, her hands shaking, as she turned on the flashlight feature. The sudden, bright beam cut through the darkness, casting long, sharp shadows on the peeling walls, figures that seemed to leap around her. The limited light made her wonder if it wouldn't be better to turn around and leave that cursed place. But there was something in that cry that forced her to continue, something deeply human and heartbreaking that stirred every corner of her maternal instinct. Even though her own daughter had treated her like trash, her heart still beat with the strength of someone who had once cradled a baby in her arms and protected it from all storms. That's why she kept going, whispering tremulously, "If someone is in here, don't be afraid. I just want to help." And her words were lost in the cold air, mixing with the sound of the sobs that were becoming clearer, closer. The hallway narrowed until it ended at a large, half-rotted wooden door, just barely ajar. Through the crack, a draft of air escaped, smelling of dampness, accumulated dust, and something else, a metallic, penetrating aroma that turned her stomach but didn't stop her. She aimed the phone's beam closer to see better, and then she heard a deep, almost inaudible groan. A man's voice said, "Help, please," in a tone that chilled her blood. It didn't sound like a simple call, but like the last breath of someone clinging to life. Margaret felt her legs tremble, but she forced herself to push the door, which gave way with a prolonged moan. As it opened, the phone's light illuminated a scene that left her breathless. There, in the middle of the barn, a man was tied hand and foot to a post with thick ropes, his face covered in dried blood and bruises. His half-closed eyes barely held her gaze, while his split lips moved to say in a thread of a voice, "Please, the babies, don't let them die. They need help." A few feet away from him, in a wicker basket, 2 babies were crying inconsolably, their faces red and their tiny fists flailing in the air, as if pleading for help from a world that had turned its back on them. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat, suffocating her, and her eyes filled with tears at the sight of the tiny creatures, covered only with thin blankets, shivering from the cold. She couldn't understand what she was seeing, or how it was possible that someone could abandon such young children in these conditions. Her instinct pushed her toward them as she murmured, "It's okay. I'm going to help you, my little ones," although confusion was growing inside her, as she couldn't connect the dots between the injured man, the baby's cries, and the ominous silence of the farmhouse that seemed to hold secrets far too heavy. It was then that she noticed an open suitcase on the floor, just inches from the tied-up man. Inside it were stacks of cash, perfectly arranged, some still wrapped in paper bands indicating sums impossible for a life like hers. Just when she thought her situation couldn't get any more desperate, Margaret stumbles into a scene from a nightmare. She now faces a choice: run from this incredible danger or help these innocent lives. This one decision, made in this dark, terrifying barn, is the moment her story truly turns. Margaret felt a chill as she realized that money must be the cause of so much pain, and she wondered aloud what kind of place she had found. As the shadows danced on the walls and the children's cries mixed with the weak moan of the man, who watched her pleadingly, his eyes full of a fear so pure it seemed to cut through the darkness and straight into her heart, Margaret felt the air in the barn grow thicker, almost unbreathable, while the phone's light in her hand wavered with a nervous tremor that seemed to mirror her own internal state. Her heart hammered so hard inside her chest that it hurt, and every second that passed plunged her deeper into a struggle between the instinct to flee and the compassion that kept her rooted to the spot in front of this devastating scene. The tied-up man barely managed to open his eyes, and in a thin voice that cracked like glass about to shatter, whispered through tears, "If you don't help me, he will come back and kill us all." His words filled the air with a panic so palpable that Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, from the nape of her neck to her heels. But they also awakened something in her, a distant echo of all the times she had protected her daughter Jessica from childhood fears, from feverish nights, from the blows of life. An inner voice told her that no one deserves to be left behind, that no one deserves to die alone, least of all these two babies, who were now crying desperately, their red faces and trembling hands raised to the void, as if trying to grasp a bit of human warmth. Fear immobilized her as her mind screamed at her to get out of there, that she didn't know this man, that she had no idea what kind of mess he was tangled in, or why there was a suitcase full of cash next to him. Maybe they were criminals. Maybe she would be the next one tied up and left to die. But then her gaze fell on the little ones again, and she felt a pang in her chest so sharp it made her let out a small whimper. She remembered Jessica as a baby, sleeping on her chest, and the feeling of a love so pure and unconditional it was impossible to describe. She remembered the nights she promised herself. She would always be there to protect her, no matter the circumstances. And even though life was showing her that this promise was not reciprocated, something inside her refused to abandon other innocent lives, just as she had been abandoned. She closed her eyes for an instant and took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage she felt age and exhaustion had stolen from her. Her eyes adjusted a little more to the gloom, and she spotted a shelf on the wall where rusty tools hung, among them a wooden-handled knife that looked like it had been forgotten there for years. She walked with silent, trembling steps to grab it, propping the phone against a bale of hay to light the area. The man's voice broke into barely audible pleas, saying, "Please, don't let them die." Margaret returned to his side, and using the phone's glow, tried to cut the ropes. Her wrinkled fingers trembled so much that the blade slipped a couple of times, grazing her skin, but she didn't stop. The rope was stiff and damp, soaked in blood and sweat, and each cut seemed to take an eternity, while Margaret's heart beat to the rhythm of a war drum. Finally, the bindings gave way, and the man's body fell forward, but she caught him as best she could, whispering, slowly, "Don't fall." The man murmured a hoarse, "Thank you." "I'm Ryan," he gasped, his voice raspy from pain and disuse. My children. Are they okay?" Margaret looked over at the basket where the crying had subsided slightly. "They're cold, but they're alive," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. The name humanized him, grounding the nightmare in a terrible reality. Ryan. His name was Ryan. His breathing was heavy, and his eyes, still full of fear, searched to make sure this wasn't a dream. Margaret then knelt beside the babies and reached out her hands to stroke their heads, covered in fine hair damp with sweat. She spoke to them with a tenderness that sprang naturally from her soul, saying, "It's okay, my little ones. Everything will be all right. You're not alone now." And although tears continued to fall down her cheeks, the children began to calm down, little by little. Their sobs subsided into small whimpers, while one of them even gripped Margaret's wrinkled finger with his tiny hand, as if he knew he had found refuge in the midst of the nightmare. She hugged them to her chest, feeling the warmth of their fragile little bodies and an overwhelming instinct to protect them with her own life, if necessary. But that calm moment was abruptly interrupted when, from outside the barn, a distant but unmistakable sound arrived. The roar of an engine approaching on the dirt road, accompanied by the crunch of tires on loose gravel. Margaret felt her blood run cold, and the man's eyes shot open with renewed terror, whispering, "It's him. He's coming for us." Margaret quickly grabbed her phone and switched off the light, plunging the barn into near-total darkness. The silence became absolute, save for the growing noise of the vehicle that was now too close to ignore. The darkness inside the barn was so thick it felt as if the air had turned into a viscous mass, difficult to breathe. The only sound breaking the suffocating silence was the ragged breathing of Margaret and Ryan as they clung to the small bodies of the babies, who, perhaps sensing the adults' fear, remained strangely quiet. Margaret clutched the baby boy to her chest with almost desperate strength. She could feel the rapid, fragile beating of that tiny heart, while her own mind debated between panic and a forced serenity. She thought about how she had gotten to this moment, how a 7-8-year-old woman, abandoned on a dirt road, now found herself hidden behind some rotting barrels, protecting two innocent creatures from a danger she barely understood. Ryan, beside her, his face still bloodied and his body weak, kept his eyes fixed on the barn door like a cornered animal. He held the baby girl in his arms so delicately that his fingers trembled nonstop, and in a barely audible whisper, he said, "If he finds us, he'll kill us without hesitation." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine and tried to calm him, saying, "We're not going to let that happen." Although inside, a cruel voice repeated that maybe there was no way to avoid it. The sounds from outside grew clearer. The car engine stopped, accompanied by a screech of brakes that tore through the dead silence of the night. Then a car door slammed, echoing like thunder, and the crunch of boots on the gravel chilled Margaret's blood. A man's voice broke the stillness with an almost theatrical force, saying, "Ryan, I know you're in there. Don't make this harder for yourself or for those with you." Margaret felt her legs weaken and cold sweat soak the fabric of her blouse as she squeezed her eyes shut, praying silently, "God, please don't let him find us." Ryan, his face as taut as a rope about to snap, turned his head toward her and whispered, "If he gets in, we have no escape." And Margaret replied, "Then we can't just wait here. We have to do something." Even though she truly didn't know what they could do in such a desperate situation, the steps approached, echoing on the wood of the farmhouse porch, as if the man was enjoying every second of this hunt. The darkness in the barn was almost total, save for a single ray of moonlight slipping through a crack in the roof, barely illuminating Ryan's terrified eyes. Then a bang shook the barn as the door was kicked violently and a shadow projected onto the floor. The voice called out again, this time closer, more threatening. "There's nowhere to hide, Ryan. Don't be stupid. Give yourself up, and maybe I'll let you live." Margaret felt her heart was going to burst when suddenly a gunshot rang out, shattering the night into 1,000 pieces. The bullet tore through the wall just inches from the barrels, sending a shower of splinters over them. The sound of that gunshot changes everything. The threat is no longer distant, it's right here, and it's deadly. Margaret is now fighting not just for herself, but for Ryan and these 2 babies. How can an elderly woman possibly escape a man with a gun? Her next move is coming right up. Margaret stifled a scream and leaned over the baby to protect him, while the sound of her own heartbeat filled her ears. Ryan gritted his teeth, his face contorted with helplessness, and whispered, "We can't stay here, or they'll kill us all." Margaret felt every muscle in her body tense, but also a strange determination rising from deep within her, as if all her years of sacrifice and pain had prepared her for this moment. She gripped Ryan's hand tightly and, in a firm though quiet voice, said, "We have to leave, now. It's our only chance." He nodded with an almost imperceptible movement, just as the babies began to stir, letting out small whimpers that could give them away at any moment. Margaret gripped Ryan's hand tightly and, in a firm though quiet voice, said, Margaret pressed a finger to the baby boy's lips, murmuring, "Shh, my love, please, just a little longer. Hold on for Nana." The tension was so unbearable that even the air seemed to vibrate around them. And when they finally heard the man's footsteps moving away toward the other side of the barn, they looked at each other with silent resolve and began to crawl with extreme care, trying not to make the slightest noise. Every creak of the wood under their knees was a dagger piercing their chests. They managed to reach a small back door that was half hidden behind a pile of old sacks and pushed it with almost superhuman effort as the cold pre-dawn air hit their faces. Outside, the field stretched out in endless shadows, dotted with thickets and twisted trees. Margaret helped Ryan to his feet and told him in a ragged voice, "We have to find help, right now." And he nodded, saying, "In the main house, there's an old phone. If we can get to it, maybe we can call the police." They walked as best they could, leaning on each other, with the babies in their arms. Every step was a challenge, and the fear of being discovered made them clench their teeth until they reached the door of the main house. Ryan fumbled in the dark until he found the rotary phone hanging on the wall. "The police," he whispered, his fingers trembling as he reached for the dial. "We have to call the police." "Wait," Margaret hissed, her mind racing. "Keith might be monitoring the lines. Or he might have friends on the local force. We don't know who to trust." She looked frantically around the dark kitchen, her eyes landing on a small, faded address book hanging by a string next to the phone. "A neighbor," she said, her voice firm. "We need a neighbor, someone close." She flipped through the brittle pages under the moonlight from the window. P. There, Peterson, Ruth. Next farm over. With shaking hands, Margaret dialed the number. The ringing tone echoed once, twice. Then a sleepy voice answered. Hello? Mrs. Peterson, my name is Margaret. I'm at the old Ryan farmhouse, she stammered. There's a man. He's trying to kill us. He has a gun. Please. We have children. We need the Times state, Times police, not local. Tell them shots fired. Please, hurry. Please, I'm in my old farmhouse. There's a man trying to kill me and my children. His name is Keith. Call the police. Tell them shots fired. Please, hurry. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Dear Lord, Ryan, are you safe? No. He's coming back. Please, just call them. Now. Ryan slammed the phone down. The footsteps outside stopped. They heard a man's voice, Keith's yell in frustration. I know you're in there, Ryan. You can't hide forever. A car door slammed, followed by the roar of an engine and the sound of tires speeding away on the dirt road. He was gone. For now. Silence flooded the house, thick and heavy. Margaret and Ryan stayed frozen for a long time, listening to the engine fade into the distance. I think he's gone, Ryan whispered, his body slumping in relief. But he'll be back. He won't just leave that money. Margaret nodded, her heart still hammering. The police. Mrs. Peterson called them, but we don't know how long they'll be. And the babies. She looked at the children, who were beginning to stir. They're hungry. We can't just wait here. The early morning light was beginning to tint the sky in shades of gray and violet when Margaret, her feet still aching and her body exhausted to the limit, decided she had to do something more for these little ones, who were now breathing calmly in her arms. The little girl slept with her mouth slightly open, and the boy clung to a corner of her blouse as if afraid she might disappear at any moment. Ryan remained seated in an old kitchen chair, his back against the wall, his face pale. His eyes closed at times, but he forced himself to keep them open. Margaret told him she had to find milk for the babies, because they couldn't last much longer without eating. And he, in a barely audible thread of a voice, replied that the neighboring farm was inhabited by an older woman named Mrs. Ruth Peterson, and maybe she could help. Margaret took a deep breath and nodded. She felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, like carrying a sack of rocks. But something inside her told her she couldn't fail them, not Ryan, and not these helpless creatures. She left the farmhouse with a steady step, though her heart was beating so hard she could feel the pulse in her temples. The cold morning wind hit her face, pulling tears from her eyes that mixed with those already flowing from her contained fear. In the distance, she spotted the small wooden house with a neglected garden and a pair of chickens pecking at the dirt. She knocked on the door with trembling hands while rehearsing the lie she would have to tell in her mind. She knew she couldn't reveal the truth without putting everyone in greater danger. The door opened slowly, revealing a woman with gray hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes tired but filled with an alert curiosity. Margaret stepped forward, saying, "Good morning. I'm so sorry to bother you this early. I'm the grandmother of 2 little ones traveling with me, and they desperately need milk." The woman observed her with a look somewhere between suspicion and compassion and replied, "Please, come in, ma'am. It must have been a difficult night." Margaret thanked her with a nod, the knot in her stomach tightening as she crossed the threshold. Mrs. Peterson led her to the kitchen and, without asking many questions, placed a pot on the stove. Margaret sat on the edge of a chair and watched the woman's wrinkled hands move efficiently as the aroma of warm milk filled the air. She then felt the need to speak, to release at least a part of the anguish she carried inside. But she forced herself to be quiet. She remembered Ryan's words before she left. He had warned her that anyone could be a risk because they didn't know how far Keith's tentacles reached. When the woman handed her a jar of fresh milk, Margaret smiled with a gesture that hid the trembling of her lips and said, "God bless you. You don't know how much this means to us." "Mrs." Peterson returned the smile, saying, "Take good care of those little angels." And Margaret replied with a sincere thank you, while inwardly repeating that she had to stay strong. Back at the farmhouse, she found Ryan with his eyes half open and the babies beginning to stir restlessly. She handed him the jar, saying, "Luckily, The neighbor didn't suspect anything, and Ryan nodded with a sigh of relief as they fed the little ones with improvised spoonfuls of warm milk. Ryan spoke, his voice hoarse and heavy with sadness, saying, "Keith betrayed me. He wants everything for himself." And he recounted how his partner of many years had planned to take over the winery and the money from a $1 million export, faking an accident to eliminate him from the equation. Margaret listened, her chest tight with anger and helplessness, saying, "I don't understand how someone can be so cruel." And Ryan looked at her with dull eyes, replying, "Money brings out the worst in people." It was then that Margaret, with the determination only mothers have when they know there's no turning back, said, "We have to think about how to stop him. We can't wait for him to come back and find us like rats in a trap." Ryan looked at her with a new glint in his eyes, as if this woman he barely knew was giving him the spark of hope he thought was extinguished, and together they began to form a plan. "My phone," he whispered, gesturing to his jacket pocket, which was lying discarded near the barn post. "He took my wallet, but he missed the phone. If we can get him to talk, we can record it." The idea was to lure Keith to the farmhouse with the excuse of giving him the money and to use the phone's voice recorder to capture his confession. They spoke in low voices for hours, refining every detail as the dawn slowly illuminated the dirty walls and the babies slept peacefully, oblivious to the storm brewing over their small lives. When Ryan fell asleep from exhaustion, Margaret picked up his cell phone to see if they could send a message for help. But when she unlocked the screen, an image made her blood run cold. In the gallery was a recent photo of Keith shaking hands with Mark, with a smile that seemed to hide a dark pact. Margaret felt the room spin around her as a piercing thought shot through her mind like a lightning bolt. My own son-in-law is involved in this. And in that instant, she understood that her daughter's betrayal was even deeper than she had imagined. This is the moment the entire story snaps into focus. It wasn't just abandonment, it was a plan. Her own son-in-law, Mark, is tied to this violence. You can just feel Margaret's world shattering all over again. Now, the fight isn't just for survival, it's for justice. The silence in the farmhouse was so thick, you could hear the slow creaking of the wood as the icy afternoon wind slipped through the cracks of the broken windows. Margaret remained seated in a rickety chair, her back hunched and her hands clasped in her lap. Her red eyes stared at an invisible point on the floor as tears fell without permission, sliding down the deep wrinkles that narrated a lifetime of love, sacrifice, and now betrayal. On the phone screen was still the image that had knocked the wind out of her lungs moments before. Mark, her son-in-law, standing next to Keith, with a satisfied smile and his hand extended in a handshake that seemed to seal a macabre pact. Margaret felt an abyss open up beneath her feet as a murmur escaped her trembling lips, repeating, as if to convince herself it couldn't be true, "My own son-in-law, too." And memories of Sunday family dinners flooded her mind. Mark's jokes at the table, the times he told her in a kind voice that she would always have a place in their home, every gesture, now stained with hypocrisy and falsehood, broke her heart a little more. Ryan watched her from the corner where he was resting, trying to regain his strength. His face still showed the marks of the beating, but his eyes held a spark of humanity and understanding that contrasted with the cruelty of the outside world. In a soft, almost paternal voice, he said, "Don't let their evil make you forget who you are, Mrs. Hayes. Because you deserve a better home, a home where they don't see you as a burden, but as the strong, valuable woman you are." Margaret looked up, her eyes misty, and nodded, with a barely perceptible movement, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to tear her chest apart, because even though Ryan's words were a balm, the wound was still open and bleeding. She replied in a thin voice, "I don't understand how I was so blind, how I didn't see the truth in my own daughter's eyes." And Ryan sighed, "Sometimes love makes us blind, but it also gives us the strength to keep fighting." At that moment, the baby's cries broke the tension in the room like an unexpected ray of light. Margaret stood up with visible effort and walked toward them. As she took them in her arms, she felt their tiny hands cling to her wrinkled fingers with a trust so pure it brought a smile to her face amid the pain. The little girl let out a muffled giggle, her eyes shining with innocence, and the boy imitated her with a babble that sounded like an attempt at laughter. Margaret felt a warmth in her chest she hadn't experienced in a long time, and she murmured, stroking their little heads, You two are the reason I'll keep standing, even if the world falls down around me." The bond between her and these little ones strengthened with every second, and in her heart, a fierce determination was born to protect them, no matter the cost. But that brief moment of tenderness was abruptly interrupted when Ryan's phone vibrated on the table, letting out a buzz that echoed in the stillness of the house. Margaret picked it up with trembling hands and read the screen, where a curt, cold text message read, "48 hours, or everyone dies." Her fingers tightened around the device as her lips murmured with alarm and desperation. "We can't let this paralyze us. We have to act before it's too late." Ryan looked at her, his jaw tight and a worried glint in his eyes that confirmed what they both knew. The clock had started ticking, and now every second counted to save their lives. The silence in the farmhouse was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional sound of dry leaves rustled by the wind, slipping through the open windows, and making the worn-out curtains flutter like ethereal ghosts. Margaret stood in the center of the living room, her hands crossed over her chest, her eyes fixed on Ryan. Despite his body's weakness, he worked with determination, setting up his phone. He started the voice recording app and carefully slid the device between two loose floorboards near the main table, covering it with a bit of dust and straw so it was completely hidden. Margaret couldn't help but ask, her voice laden with anxiety, if he was sure the phone's microphone would be strong enough, because they couldn't afford any mistakes. Ryan replied, "It's the only thing we have to prove the truth. Without that evidence, it's just our word against his." She nodded, her head trembling slightly, aware that every move was risky, but at the same time feeling an unknown strength inside her, whispering that she had to fight, even if it was the last battle of her life. The plan was dangerous, almost suicidal, but it was their only option. Lure Keith with the excuse of handing over the money, make him trust them enough to say the words that would incriminate him, and record every second to have proof of his crimes. Margaret watched Ryan as he adjusted the lens of a hidden camera and remembered the first time she saw him, tied up and bloody in the barn, as vulnerable as the two little ones now sleeping in a makeshift basket just a few feet away. The difference was that now his eyes held not just fear, but also a spark of courage that Margaret recognized, because it was the same one burning in hers every time she thought about how they had abandoned her on a dirt road like she was old furniture, and how she had promised she wouldn't let that injustice happen to anyone else under her care. When everything was ready, Ryan took a deep breath and dialed Keith's number from the cell phone. The man's voice on the other end sounded confident, almost mocking, when he said, "I'm surprised you're still alive, but that'll end soon." And Ryan, feigning a defeated tone, replied, "I don't want any more trouble. I just want out of this, and I'll give you what you're looking for. But I need you to come alone, and for this to end once and for all. See?" There was a tense silence before Keith agreed. "Fine, but if you try anything, I swear neither you nor that useless old woman will live to tell about it." Margaret closed her eyes for an instant and clenched her fists upon hearing him belittle her, feeling an icy rage anchor in her chest. But she kept calm because she knew every second of this encounter could mean the difference between life and death. Hours later, the roar of an engine broke the afternoon silence, and Margaret watched through a crack as a black sedan approached, kicking up a cloud of dust. Her stomach tightened when she saw Keith get out of the vehicle with a gun in his hand, and that arrogant smile that chilled her blood. Ryan was waiting for him in the living room with the briefcase of money on the table. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but his expression was firm as he told him, "Here's everything you wanted. Now, leave us alone." And Keith advanced with slow, confident steps, like a predator enjoying his prey's fear, his eyes scanning every corner with suspicion. Margaret, from her hiding place in the kitchen, trembled but kept her breathing as controlled as possible, thinking that if everything went wrong, at least she had done what she had to protect these children. The tension peaked when Keith, after opening the briefcase and verifying the money, let out a sinister laugh and shouted furiously, "No one takes what's mine, not you, and not that useless old woman." And in that moment, Ryan's voice resonated with unexpected strength. "You have no right to destroy lives for greed, Keith." The argument escalated, and Margaret could hear the man slam the gun on the table while uttering increasingly violent threats, unaware that every word was being recorded by the hidden cameras. Just as it seemed Keith was about to lose control and shoot, the front door burst open, and several armed police officers stormed the farmhouse, shouting, "Get down! Gun on the floor!" Keith spun around, surprised, but he didn't have time to react before being subdued by two agents, who ripped the gun from his hands and handcuffed him while he spewed insults and threats. Ryan slumped into the chair, his face covered in sweat, and Margaret came out of her hiding place with tears in her eyes, hugging the babies, who were waking up, startled by the noise. Mrs. Peterson's call had worked. The authorities had arrived just in time. What an incredible, heart-pounding moment of relief. Their desperate plan worked, and the immediate danger is over. But as those police lights flash, we all know this isn't the true end. The man in handcuffs is just one piece of the puzzle. The betrayal from her own family is still out there. The calm that followed was tense, almost unreal. An officer gently retrieved Ryan's phone from the floorboards, listened to the recording, and then looked at the photo of Mark and Keith. "We have the confession," the officer said grimly, "and it looks like we have an accomplice to find." In the days that followed, Margaret became the central figure of the house. Her presence filled every corner of the winery with a warmth no one had felt in years. She woke up early to prepare the little ones' bottles. She rocked them in her arms, singing them lullabies she had learned in her youth, and laughed with them when their little hands tried to catch the sunlight filtering through the windows. The farm workers began to affectionately call her Nana, and soon the babies repeated that word with their babbling voices, making Margaret's heart expand with a love so deep she felt she could protect them from the whole world every time she heard those sweet syllables. Nana, Nana. A knot of emotion would tighten her throat, but also a renewed strength pushed her to move forward, not letting the past chain her down. Ryan watched this relationship with silent respect, and on more than one occasion he approached Margaret to say, his voice thick with gratitude, "You didn't just save our lives. You've given my children a grandmother and me a mother I thought I'd never have." Margaret would reply by stroking Ryan's cheek. "And you've given me a reason to keep living when I thought my story was over." The connection between them grew into an unbreakable bond, where shared pain transformed into a familial love that didn't need blood to be real. The large house at the winery regained the sound of children's laughter, and the walls that once held silence now resonated with stories, songs, and the murmur of a home being rebuilt on the ruins of past betrayals. However, that hard-won peace began to tremble when one afternoon, while Margaret was watering the flowers in the garden, she felt the vibration of a powerful engine approaching. She looked up and saw a black limousine advancing slowly up the gravel path leading to the winery entrance. The dark shine of the vehicle under the New Jersey sun seemed like a bad omen, and a chill ran down Margaret's spine as she muttered to herself, "Who's coming now? With what intentions?" Inside the house, Ryan had already noticed the sound, and with a furrowed brow, headed to the door, taking a deep breath like someone preparing to face a new storm. Because deep down, they both knew that peace is always fragile when the past still has scores to settle. The sound of the engine slowly faded as the black limousine sat parked in front of the winery's main entrance. The road dust still hung in the air, forming a light mist that made the moment seem like a scene suspended in time. Margaret remained motionless next to the rose bushes she herself had begun tending to in recent months. Her wrinkled hands held a half-empty watering can, and her eyes fixed on the vehicle's door with a mix of curiosity and a dark premonition that tightened her chest. She knew no one arrived in a car like that without an important reason, and certainly not without hidden intentions. The door opened with a soft click, and Jessica stepped out alone. She wore sunglasses and an expensive white linen dress that contrasted with the dusty road. She looked smaller without Mark at her side, almost lost. Margaret sensed a contained tension in her posture, a rigidity that looked like a carefully rehearsed performance. Jessica took off her sunglasses, revealing red-rimmed eyes that seemed to desperately seek her mother's gaze. She took a couple of steps toward her, her lips trembling, and said in a thin voice, "Mom, we are so sorry. We can't live with what we did. Please, can we start over? We're still a family." Margaret didn't move an inch. She felt her heart give a painful jolt, the old wound aching. A year ago, those words, "We're still a family," would have made her weep with relief. She would have rushed forward, forgiven everything, just to reclaim the title of mother. But as she stood there, the sun warm on her face, she looked at the woman who was her daughter, and she felt nothing. Not hatred, not even anger, just a profound, quiet emptiness. The woman who had been abandoned on that dirt road had died during that long, cold night. The woman standing here now was Nana. Her family was just behind her. Her years of suffering and the slow healing realization of her own daughter's nature had taught her that silence was not weakness. It was a boundary. At that moment, Ryan appeared in the doorway of the house with the twins in his arms. His presence filled the space with a different energy, protective and firm. His steps echoed on the porch wood as he descended calmly, never taking his eyes off Jessica. His voice was deep and clear when he said, "She saved my life. You don't deserve her." And every word landed like a dull thud in the air. Jessica put a hand to her chest with a pained expression, as if those words had pierced her. But Margaret sensed there were no sincere tears in her eyes, only the reflection of someone who had lost something valuable and couldn't bear the thought of not getting it back. Ryan moved closer to Margaret and whispered, "You don't have to listen to this if you don't want to. We can ask them to leave right now." But she gently raised a hand, asking for silence. Her eyes locked onto her daughter's, and in that instant, she seemed to see not the 40-year-old woman in front of her, but the little girl she once held in her arms, the girl who once trusted her blindly and who had now become someone capable of abandoning her on a dirt road as if she were a burden. With a serenity that surprised even Ryan, Margaret spoke, her voice firm and steady. "Forgiveness doesn't mean returning to where I was hurt. I've learned that some scars teach us to protect ourselves, not to go back." This is the moment Margaret reclaims her power, not with anger, but with wisdom. She shows us that true strength isn't just about surviving, but about knowing what you deserve. She has found her real home, and she's not letting anything threaten it. But what does a family built from ashes really look like? Let's watch them find their peace. And her words were so definitive that silence took hold of the place for a few eternal seconds. Jessica burst into tears that at first seemed sincere, but soon transformed into shrill sobs of frustration. She spun on her heels and stumbled back to the car without looking back, slamming the door shut. The limousine pulled away, leaving behind the roar of the engine and a cloud of dust that slowly dissipated in the heavy South Jersey afternoon air. The air of the winery filled each morning with the sweet scent of ripe grapes and the sound of leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The workers walked through the vineyards with a new lightness, as if the place had been purified of the shadows that once enveloped it, and now there was only room for life. At the center of it all was Margaret. Her small but imposing figure radiated a warmth so genuine it seemed to permeate every corner of the property. She walked through the winery halls, greeting each employee by name, asking about their families, making sure everyone felt part of something bigger than just a business. Some quietly called her the Grand Dame of the Vineyard, with an almost reverent respect, because although she didn't own anything tangible, her presence had become the soul of the winery. Ryan watched her from the entrance with a mix of gratitude and pride. He knew that without her, neither he nor his children would have survived the betrayal and the pain. Now he felt indebted to this woman who, having no obligation to do so, had rescued them from the ruins. One afternoon of bright sun and clear skies, Ryan gathered all the employees and many local friends near the main entrance. He stepped up to a small podium, his eyes finding Margaret, who held the twins. "When I thought I had lost everything," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "a woman, who had no obligation to me, decided to risk her life to save us. She taught me that true wealth isn't money, but in the ability to love without asking for anything in return." He then turned and gestured to a new sign hanging over the archway. When the dust settled, the golden letters shone in the light. "The Hayes Ryan Home." Some murmured and clapped enthusiastically, and Margaret felt a lump in her throat as she read it. Ryan turned to her and said, his voice thick with emotion, "I can't think of a better name, because you have made this place a true home for all of us." Margaret looked at him, her eyes shining, and replied, "I never imagined life would give me the chance to form a family at this point. But now I understand that family isn't always the one born from blood, but the one born from love and gratitude." The twins played at their feet, not understanding the scope of those words, but with the natural ease of those who feel safe in the world around them. As the months passed, the children grew up healthy and happy. Every day, they took firmer steps through the gardens, holding Margaret's hand, who guided them with infinite patience. The image of the elderly woman walking with the little ones, holding her wrinkled fingers, became a daily scene that touched anyone who saw it. The workers would stop their tasks to greet them, and the children would respond with their childish voices, calling her Nana, a term that had started as a babble but had become a title of love and respect. Margaret often sat on a stone bench while the children collected flowers and rocks for their games. She watched them with her heart full of a calm she hadn't remembered feeling in decades. In her mind, images of Jessica sometimes appeared, but they no longer hurt as they used to, because she had learned to let go of what she couldn't change. Now, all her energy was dedicated to caring for and loving these little ones as if they were her own flesh. Visits to the winery increased, and with them came guests from different parts of the country who were enchanted not only by the wines, but by the story of resilience and love that permeated the place. Some, upon seeing her, would bow respectfully, saying, "You are the grand dame of the vineyard," and Margaret would smile humbly, replying, "I'm just a woman who was lucky enough to find a new purpose when I least expected it." At family dinners, she sat at the head of the table, surrounded by laughter and lively conversation, while the twins asked her to tell stories from when she was young. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the vineyards and the sky was painted orange and purple, the little girl climbed into her lap and, with eyes bright with curiosity, whispered, "Nana, tell us another story?" And in that moment, Margaret understood that she had finally found the place where she had always belonged. The afternoon sun fell softly on the garden, drawing long shadows from the newly pruned rose bushes and from the small bodies of Olivia and Liam, who, with their dirt-stained hands, tried to imitate Margaret's movements as she bent down to plant new flowers in a specially chosen corner next to the stone bench. Her wrinkled, strong fingers, marked by years of work and sacrifice, sank into the damp earth with the skill of someone who had learned to respect and love life from its roots. Margaret's voice was a constant whisper that the twins listened to with fascination as she explained, "When we plant a flower, we not only give life to the earth, but also to the heart, because watching something we care for grow reminds us that we can always start over." Liam looked at her with those big, dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything and asked innocently, "Do flowers also feel sad when they're alone?" Margaret smiled tenderly and replied, "Maybe so, but when they are surrounded by other flowers and loving hands that care for them, they feel happy, just like people when they find a home." A few steps away, Ryan watched the scene, his arms crossed, his expression a mix of gratitude and pride. His heart filled with such a deep affection for this woman who had burst into his life at its darkest moment and who had now become the pillar of the family. He walked slowly until he stood behind Margaret, and when she straightened up to wipe the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand, he wrapped his arms around her shoulders in a warm hug and whispered in her ear, his voice thick with emotion, "You are my family, Mom, and there are not enough words to thank you for what you've done for us." Margaret stood still for an instant, feeling the tears well up in her eyes, but then she placed one of her hands over Ryan's and replied in a whisper, "The real thanks is this moment, because you have given me the chance to love again, without fear." While the twins busied themselves arranging small stones around the newly planted sprouts, the golden twilight reflected off a metal plaque installed at the main entrance of the farm. The letters gleamed with a serene shine that seemed to celebrate the story that had been woven there. The Hayes, Ryan home, where abandonment became love. That phrase wasn't just a name for the property, it was a declaration of what they had managed to build together after having gone through abandonment, fear, and betrayal. Now, every corner of the winery breathed life and hope, as if the pain had transformed into fertile soil for love and redemption. The gentle wind moved the leaves of the nearby trees, rustling through the blooming garden where Margaret stood, flanked by Ryan and the twins. The horizon lit up with the warm colors of the sunset, as if nature itself wanted to pay homage to the strength of the woman who held them all together. Margaret looked at the sky, her heart full, thinking a final thought that felt as true as the earth beneath her feet. "They thought they left me with nothing, but they left me room to find everything. Mrs. Margaret's journey teaches us an incredible lesson. Sometimes, the family you choose or the family that finds you is stronger than the family you were born into. She turned a cruel act of abandonment into a new beginning filled with love. Now, I truly want to hear from you. If you were in Mrs. Margaret's position, could you forgive Jessica when she returned? Or did she do the right thing by protecting her new family? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. It shows that you are a person with a kind heart who appreciates deep values. We have another moving story waiting for you right here. See you in the next video.